to the brave folks who came despite the bomb scares and other things happening on campus today. Glad that you're here. I'm Annalise Riles. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and Associate Provost for Global Affairs. And it is truly an honor today for me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Beatrice Fihn, a person who's arguably done more than almost anyone alive today to help prevent another catastrophic nuclear war. Beatrice has just stepped down as Executive Director of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And ICAN has successfully led the fight to create and bring into force a new treaty, the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons. It came into force on January 22nd, 2021, and it now has 68 state parties and 92 signatory states, so a huge accomplishment. For this, ICAN was awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and continues the work of getting more signatories, working for implementation of this treaty at the local, national, regional, and international level, and much more. So Beatrice is going to speak to us a little bit today about her work for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have plenty of time for conversation with all of us. And for the many people who are joining us online today, you can put your questions in the chat and someone will run those up to the front and we'll make sure that we get those as well. So for now, please give your warmest welcome to Beatrice Fihn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annalise. And thank you, everyone. It's really, truly a pleasure to be here and gorgeous weather and lovely day here. I had a lovely morning walk along the lake. It's so nice. It's my first time here, so I'm really happy to be here. One of the first things that people say when they hear what I do for a living and working on achieving nuclear disarmament is, good luck. That's never going to happen. And they don't mean it. Most of people don't mean it well. They say also like, oh, it's a very nice thing to work for, very good, but it's not really going to happen, is it? And I don't blame them, right? It is one of those issues that people feel is just impossible. That's the narrative that has been created around this issue for a long time. But I'm here to tell you that it is not only possible, we are also working to make it happen right now. It might not feel like that when you read the news and when you think about this issue. So let me begin at a very logical starting point for this, Godzilla. And bear with me here, it's coming. In 1954 in Japan, Japan was in a post-war occupation that included very strict measures to hide the health impacts of the atomic bombings to the public. The US allowed virtually no coverage of the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it seemed even entirely possible that these catastrophic events would be successfully buried in the public mind. But Godzilla actually helped to change that. Ishiro Honda, the Japanese filmmaker, used real-life events to conjure a story of a monster from the deep, deep sea, awakened by a hydrogen bomb testing in the ocean. And the filmmaker Honda, he had actually moved through Hiroshima as a soldier in the days after the US first dropped the bomb that was named Little Boy on the city. And he witnessed the horror firsthand. And the monster Godzilla was actually a nuclear weapon come to life. He had painstakingly created from actual photos of the scars of Hiroshima survivors. Photos of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were used to create the scenes of destructions by Godzilla's wrath. And Godzilla was a destroyer of cities, like the nuclear weapons that created him. And the film ends with this hero scientist destroying Godzilla with an even more powerful bomb, but making sure that he kills himself and all his research too, to ensure that his weapon will never fall into the hands of the superpowers, who will no doubt destroy the Earth with it. And this really powerful story of nuclear weapons from the only country that have been attacked by these weapons was really buried in the first version created by Hollywood, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. About 40 minutes of that story dealing with the nuclear theme was removed and replaced with 20 minutes of new scenes with an American journalist as a hero. And that was the version that was distributed to the world. And Honda's original version was hidden for 50 years. And the New York Times reviewed the original Godzilla when it was finally released in its original form in 2004, and pointed out that the film was a vehicle for imagining the unimaginable, speaking the unspeakable. And that's really what we would try to do with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, together with partners like the International Committee of the Red Cross, together with other partners in the United Nations system and the humanitarian organizations that would respond to a nuclear attack. We've been imagining the unimaginable and speaking the unspeakable in the halls of power. And the supporters of nuclear weapons, the supporters of the status quo, they censored Godzilla, in many ways continues to prevent conversations about the unspeakable harm that nuclear weapons do. And just actually an example, for a couple of days ago, when President Biden visited the memorial site of the US atomic bombers of Hiroshima during the G7 meeting on Friday. Already, we've heard stories from before they went, the teams of the 7 leaders really fought a lot about how to visit this site without accidentally questioning the legitimacy of their ability to threaten to do this. And Biden, who, by the way, was followed by a guy with this nuclear briefcase throughout Hiroshima, ended up sending a tweet of a little film of the 7 leaders putting rafts in front of this monument. And the tweet said, "The other G7 leaders and I paid a visit to Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, where we paid our respects." Respects for what? To whom? What actually happened? It doesn't even mention the word nuclear weapons. And this is just an example of how to avoid actually talking about what happened and talking about the consequences and talking about what the realities. And it's not really about the individual tweet. The supporters of these weapons of mass destruction consistently frame the issue of nuclear weapons around terms like strategic stability, a nuclear deterrent, and other very abstract and sterile terms to avoid exposing really what they are actually talking about. Threatening to wipe out whole cities, vaporize people, commit unspeakable war crimes, poison survivors and the environment for decades, and actually risk killing humanity as we know it. And that discourse around nuclear weapons is very often stripped of humans, of impact, of the reality, until it comes across as almost just a game theory, right? A theoretical game with nuclear deterrence. It's meant to make us forget that these governments are indeed ready to threaten to mass murder hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of civilians, and simultaneously using their own cities as a kind of a human shield towards their enemy, simply hoping that the enemy won't be horrible enough to wipe them out. But in reality, nuclear weapons are not magical beasts from the depths of the ocean. They are real weapons that real people build, finance, operate, exercise with, have used in the past, have tested on many, many times. And we don't really need science fiction movies to know what these weapons do. We know what they do. We just have to be a little bit more braver than the G7 leaders in Hiroshima were last Friday and talk openly and transparently about the inhumane, unspeakable suffering that these weapons cause. For example, if the latest North Korean nuclear weapons they've developed was to detonate in central Chicago, over 500,000 people will be killed or injured immediately through the initial blast and the following firestorms. And that number doesn't include the long-term impact, the people who will die over coming days, weeks, years, and decades due to horrible diseases, cancers, birth defects. I'm not sure really what the situation is in Chicago, but just to put those numbers in perspective, some of our campaigners in the United Kingdom did some interesting research a few years ago about the capacity to respond to nuclear detonations. Would anyone like to guess how many radiation treatment beds there are in the whole of the United Kingdom? 2. And, this would be in just one country. And in fact, the entire world does not have enough burn beds to treat the victims of one single nuclear warhead. Not that more hospital places would actually matter. In Hiroshima, 42 out of 45 hospitals were destroyed. 90% of the doctors and nurses in the city were killed or injured. In Nagasaki, ground temperature reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and radioactive rain poured down. Most victims died without any care to ease their suffering. And many who came to help, it's a very human nature thing, right, to go and help, died from the radiation later. And those bombs were really tiny in comparison to today's weapons. So there's really great power in talking about the humanitarian consequences and not choosing the geopolitical frame only that nuclear weapons are usually talked about. Like, for example, talking about testimonies from inhabitants of the Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted 67 nuclear explosions. One citizen explained it trying to survive on fish in a radioactive wasteland, saying, "We got sick from them, like when your arms and legs fall asleep and you can't feel anything. We'd get up in the morning to go to our canoes and fall over because we were so ill. We were dying." Or, for example, talking about how the long-term impact of these weapons disproportionately affect women and children. Women in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once they survived the initial blast, had nearly double the risk of developing and dying from solid cancer due to ionizing radiation exposure. Research shows that girls are considerably more likely than boys to develop thyroid cancer from nuclear fallout. And pregnant women exposed to nuclear radiation face a greater likelihood of delivering children with physical malformation and stillbirth, leading to increased maternal mortality. And these effects last generation. Near the infamous Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in Kazakhstan that was closed in the 90s, 1 in every 20 children today is born with an illness or a deformity that can be traced to nuclear weapons testing. And even beyond the immediate impacts on the people in the area where nuclear weapons are used or tested, recent climate modeling also shows that a relatively limited nuclear exchange involving around 100 nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan would result in a nuclear winter lasting 2 to 3 years, causing mass famine, impacting at least half of the world's population. People in countries far, far away from the conflict would suffer the mass deaths because of the nuclear weapons choices in maybe 2 countries on the other side of the world. And as always, the poorest and most vulnerable would suffer the most. So these aren't just city destroyers. They could really be humanity destroyers. And these are really difficult things to think about and to talk about. Much like with climate change, the impact of nuclear war can be so overwhelming, so horrible, that genuinely it is easier to ignore it. It's easier to think, no, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, just wishing that it's not going to happen won't make it go away. It won't work on climate change, and it won't work on nuclear war. And usually at this point in a lecture, I will bring up different arguments about how the risk of nuclear weapons use is actually higher than we think. But since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has started, I think most people feel it and know it. We no longer can ignore that it's happening. Just like with climate change, we no longer have to convince people so much that it is happening, but we still have to act. And I do want to highlight that there was a professor in statistics at Stanford University who, just before the war, a couple of years before the war started, did try to calculate the risk of nuclear weapons use. And it's of course very difficult because there's a lot of unknowns and things that we don't know about this. But his conclusion was that if we continue the current situation, the current risk level, a child born in 2019 is more likely than not to see nuclear weapons being used in their lifetime. And just stay in that, and especially for people who have young kids maybe. It's really terrifying. But the good thing, this is why I'm not very popular as a dinner guest sometimes. The good thing, of course, is that it has not happened yet. That we still can stop nuclear weapons from being used again. And not only can we solve this, but solutions already exist. And it's actually a lot more possible to fix this problem than most people think. And it can be done by regular people. So I want to first highlight 3 reasons why it is completely possible to eliminate nuclear weapons. And then I will talk a little bit about the stuff that's happening to make it happen. First, nuclear weapons is pretty useless. They're not high-tech, sophisticated precision guidance weapons that the military is like, wow, we really want to have these and use these. They're massive radioactive bombs, creates a lot of mess, chaos, and harm that spreads far beyond the target area and will remain in generation. It's not an attractive option for the military to actually use these weapons. You cannot use nuclear weapons on North Korea without harming South Koreans. You cannot use these weapons on actual military targets. The main value of nuclear weapons have always been in the threat to use them, not the actual use. The threat doesn't actually work if you can't really use them and if there's no incentive to use them. So they're pretty useless. Second, only 9 countries have them. And this is something that we forget most of the times. We always talk about it like everyone has it, like it's sort of a natural state of the world to possess nuclear weapons. That's a pretty small number of countries in the world. Over 180 countries with territories to manage, security threats, different internal conflicts, have still chosen not to have nuclear weapons. In particular, about 150 of these are also like not even part of nuclear weapons alliances. That's the vast majority, well over the vast majority of countries in the world that have chosen not to have them. It's pretty remarkable and a good testament to the world. You know, we're doing okay on that. And third, we actually ban and eliminate weapons all the time. We have banned biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, gliding lasers, cluster munitions. Not because these weapons are more dangerous or inhumane than nuclear weapons. We ban them because of the consequences for civilians, just like with nuclear weapons. And it's not also because nuclear weapons have some sort of special deterrent power. I mean, threatening to unleash a bioweapon could in theory be just as much of a deterrent as threatening to unleash a radioactive bomb. But we somehow managed to decide that these weapons are inhumane, not justified to use, and therefore we ban and eliminate them. Of course, we can do the same for nuclear weapons. And here's really what we're doing now to do that. Like Godzilla, we need to show the realities of nuclear weapons. Civil society, in particular with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, led by physicians against nuclear weapons and lots of different activists around the world, in partnership with governments and humanitarian organizations, really shifted the discourse, trying to shift the discourse around nuclear weapons. By talking about the humanitarian consequences and the impact of nuclear weapons and what they do to people when used, you can really reframe debate on these issues and expose the realities and kind of poke hole a little bit on some of these assumptions that we make around nuclear weapons. Because when we recognize that these weapons are weapons of mass destruction built for the mass murdering of civilians, for violating the laws of war, and to cause catastrophic humanitarian harm that will spread across borders and remain for a long time, it's really difficult to draw any other conclusion that these weapons must be illegal. The same for the weapons of that indiscriminately target civilians like chemical, biological weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. And this is something that we can all do. Regular people need to speak about the unspeakable, center humans in this conversation, expose the realities of these weapons, the indiscriminate, inhumane weapons of mass destruction that really risks to kill us all. And we need to place survivors and impacted communities at the center of these discussions. Listen to the people who suffer the most from these weapons, and refuse to let this issue be seen as a dehumanized, sterile geopolitical theory. The second thing is to use the power of international law. Now, I know there's a lot of people who don't believe that international law works, that the UN is useless and states do whatever they want. They're really wrong. There are numerous examples of how international law shifts and guides behavior. Treaties and multilateralism has actually transformed the world, with the UN Charter really at its center. Is it sometimes flawed and violent? Absolutely. But the value of a law or a norm is not only dependent on simply whether or not it's being violated. Its value is also determined by the response of such violations. And that includes the response of governments and international organizations, of course, but also civil society, media, regular people. We have the power to decide what response to violations of international law is. That's a very powerful position to be in. And that's why, in order to stand a chance of getting rid of nuclear weapons, we had to first fix the law. And that's when we took the reframing of nuclear weapons into a humanitarian issue to use as the basis for developing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The treaty was adopted in 2017 by over 120 governments at the United Nations in New York. It became international law. It entered into force in January 2021, 90 days after the 50th state had ratified it. And since then, the use, the threat to use, testing, developing, maintenance, stationing of nuclear weapons is prohibited under international law. And the treaty was really created thanks to the work of civil society, thanks to forward-thinking governments, courageous diplomats, faith communities, students, scientists, academics, activists, and many more. Through really activating regular people around the world, through campaigning in parliaments, mobilizing networks in all countries, through social media, demonstrations, petitions, local resolutions in city councils, regular people pushed over 120 governments into the negotiating room and to adopt the treaty. And that really meant that for the first time, nuclear weapons are now banned under international law. And this is the legal basis that we have for their eventual elimination. And of course, countries like the United States, China, Russia, and the other nuclear arms states have not yet joined it, so they're not legally bound by it. But it's not necessarily the point of the treaty. The treaty draws a line in the sand, clearly highlighting the international law, considers them to be immoral, illegal, and unacceptable. And more countries and more supporters this law gets, the stronger the power it will have. It really ends this, the treaty that ends this notion that this is normal behavior, that it's okay for some states to have this weapon, that the US, Russia, China, UK, and France deserves to have these and others don't, that the leaders of the 9 nuclear armed states are really to be trusted with the power to end the entire world. The rules on nuclear weapons were unjust. The South African government called it nuclear apartheid. So we fixed it. And from now on, this will be the new standard that countries will be measured against. And that is really powerful, because these shifting laws will lead eventually to shift in behavior. And that goes into the third thing that we're working on now, to use the law to stigmatize and delegitimize. Because once we have the law, we can start a stigmatizing and delegitimizing process. International law works to shift behavior. We know that. It takes time. It's not a fast process, but it works. And working to delegitimize nuclear weapons has been shown to influence the behavior of nuclear armed states. Like all states, like all people really, nuclear armed states really attach significant value in maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of the wider international community. Loss of legitimacy can mean loss of international political support, making pursuit of national interests more difficult, and in serious cases leading to isolation, ostracism, sanctions, significant economic consequences, which in turn might lead to domestic instability and unrest. So when pursuing their national aims, however selfishly, cynically, or aggressively, nuclear armed states, they do make serious efforts to justify their actions under international law and portray them as normal, accepted practices that follows established precedents. Russia was at pains to use the provisions of the UN Charter to justify its invasion of Ukraine, just as Colin Powell stood in the Security Council in 2003 to try to prove that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction to justify an invasion of Iraq. They were fighting to keep legitimacy. And even non-binding resolutions in the General Assembly have been treated very seriously. Both Russia and the United States have expended enormous energy lately on gathering votes for the recent resolutions on the conflict in Ukraine, saying that every vote matters. This really means that they are sensitive to criticism that would result in the loss of legitimacy and international support. And here's, for example, an example of how we're using that on the TPNW to lead to shifted behavior. So the treaty is the first treaty that bans the threats to use nuclear weapons. It became international law in January 2021, and the majority of governments in the world support this, including a lot of countries that are pretty friendly with Russia still. So when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it did so while threatening to use nuclear weapons if anyone interfered. And if you look at it from Russia's perspective, you might think that it's actually perfectly normal and legitimate behavior from Russia in maybe Putin's mind, a free democratic Ukraine on the verge of joining the EU and NATO is a threat to his regime, right? His authority in Russia as well. So in the logic of nuclear deterrence, it's perfectly fine to then threaten to use nuclear weapons to protect this. That's what nuclear weapons are for, right? Except it really wasn't. The world was outraged, yes, of course, because of the illegal invasion, but also because of the threats to use nuclear weapons. Things have changed because the law has changed. And we at ICAN really immediately put the treaty to work. In June 2022, a couple of months after the invasion started, around 100 states, including both states parties and signatories to the treaty, met in Vienna for the first meeting of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This was the first international meeting on nuclear weapons since the invasion had started. And this group of states issued the strongest condemnation of nuclear threats that a multilateral meeting probably ever has agreed to in history. They condemned it for being illegal and unacceptable under any circumstances. Any threat to use nuclear weapons is unacceptable and illegal. And this group of states included countries like South Africa, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Venezuela, countries that are pretty close to Russia and have not been so strong on the invasion. And that treaty then also helped them to speak out, not directly against Russia, but against the actions based on international law, and signal to Russia that this is unacceptable behavior. And then after this, so this was the first kind of big statement that was made, something quite interesting happened. At another UN conference in August 2022, that same language was picked up and used in a joint statement by 120 governments. And then a couple of weeks later, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz went to Beijing, and Germany and China together issued a joint statement. None of them supports the TPNW currently, that used the same language, saying threats to use nuclear weapons is unacceptable. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, also not a supporter of the TPNW, echoed this a couple of weeks later in September, saying any use of nuclear weapons is absolutely unacceptable. India, another nuclear armed state, used similar type of language in October. And then remarkably, at the G20 summit in Bali, where 8 nuclear armed states is part of the conversations, the host nation, Indonesia, a signature to the TPNW, backed up by South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, also TPNW states, really pushed hard in the negotiations and managed to get those 8 nuclear armed states, including Russia, to agree that any threats to use nuclear weapons is inadmissible, which is a synonym to unacceptable. And that was the French who refused to use the unacceptable. And this was really significant. And what we actually saw then was that Russia actually backed down from the threats, trying to almost gaslight the whole world, saying, we never threatened to use nuclear weapons, you misunderstood us. And it's not just talking points from ICAN. Even in an interview, one of the Assistant Secretary of States, the US State Department, said in an interview that the language from China, India, and the G20 summit really had an impact on Russia, and made them understand that they were risking losing the kind of support that they have from the rest of the world. And also Olaf Scholz spoke at a conference in February, made it open public statement that the work to condemn, all the strong condemnation globally, really pushed Russia back from threatening to use nuclear weapons. So we can really see how this actually has an impact on shifts behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that we're safe, that it's a done deal. Of course, any of these 9 leaders can just randomly decide to use nuclear weapons. That's the sort of fundamental part of having nuclear weapons, is that they can just decide to use them. So delegitimizing work, of course, has to be accompanied by actual work on elimination to be fully successful. But I think what is clear is that we cannot eliminate nuclear weapons as long as we continue to see nuclear weapons as legitimate, prestigeful, and important. So one of the most encouraging things is that while regular people, cannot pick up the phone and call Putin or Xi or Biden to say, get on with it, delegitimization, kind of sort of fundamental sort of block before that elimination, is something that we all can do. It's something that non-governmental actors can be very effective at through public conversations, culture such as media, art, research, science, political advocacy, public awareness, education. We all have the possibilities to shape norms in the world. And contrary to what many people think, I'm really not an idealist. I know that governments will always do what makes sense to them at the moment, always try to gain more power, always be prone to develop new weapons, and always will act in their own interest. And that's why we have to be super pragmatic. We have to make it harder for them, raise the threshold of what's possible for them, put obstacles in the way, make their behavior more and more difficult to get away with, throw everything that we have at them to make it in their interest to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think with international law, such as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we can all rally through instruments to contribute to such practical and pragmatic way of actually saving the world. So I thank you all for that opportunity to speak today. And very much look forward to conversations and questions.
Wow, Beatrice, that was incredible. You gave us so much to think about, and I was thinking that I wanted to replay this multiple times because you made just literally hundreds of really, really important points. So thank you very much. I know there are a lot of questions. While people are thinking about their questions, I'll just maybe just ask one to start with, and I just want to acknowledge we're just delighted to have with us today Maria Haddon, who's Chicago alderperson, and who really introduced and championed the Chicago resolution. And one of the reasons we wanted to welcome you so much right now, Beatrice, was to celebrate this resolution and its significance. And maybe I'll just start there and just ask you, you talked about delegitimization work. I love that phrase. I'm going to use it forever now. It's just really exciting. The idea that that is the work to be done, to make this feel icky, gross, awful, and something that none of us should want to be associated with. And maybe could you talk a little bit about what is the significance of something like a resolution in a city like Chicago or Evanston, where we also passed one? And in particular, I'll just mention the Chicago resolution did something really exciting, I think, which was to link the issue of nuclear weapons production to the issue of racial justice and injustice in Chicago and inequality. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that as well.
So, first, yeah, I mean, incredibly grateful for the leadership on the resolution, Maria. Really, really great, and Evanston as well. I think that these city resolutions are really practical ways to make the issue local, because our cities are actually in charge of the response to a nuclear attack. These weapons are aimed at cities. And it's the city councils that are in charge of the firefighters, the healthcare, the kind of emergency response of a city. So it's absolutely a very relevant thing for cities to do. And yeah, I mean, to me, it's nuclear weapons sometimes, again, through this kind of sterilizing way of talking about it as a geopolitical thing, gets put in a box that it's almost separate from all the other issues. All logic and sanity goes out of the window sometimes when you talk to people who support nuclear weapons. They can be massively against, can't use landmines. That would be terrible. Nuclear weapons, totally fine. It's a different issue, right? We have separated it in our minds to a little box. And to me, looking at it from and the connections to justice, equality, anti-racism, gender equality, climate change, all these issues is extremely linked. Because it's all about power, and I think that those issues goes back to all of and who has power and who gets to do bad things to others. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, I think in particularly, when you look at who the targets of nuclear weapons are, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was very easy for Americans to accept that on a Japanese population in a way that. I've read some really interesting research on this, like how they were talking about using it in Germany, for example, but no, it didn't really feel right? White Europeans, can't use nuclear weapons there. Same thing, I mean, they have been talking about using it in the Korea War, for example, as well. Same way of like dehumanizing certain people. Where do we test nuclear weapons? We've tested them on indigenous land, on colonies. I mean, and this is the same thing for every nuclear armed state. Also the non-Western nuclear, where did China test them? Uyghur land. Is that a coincidence? Absolutely not. Where did Russia test it? In Kazakhstan. People who were just not at the center of power, who were not seen as important as the people of power. The U.S. tested in Marshall Islands, in Nevada. France tested in Algeria and the Pacific. Read an incredibly interesting article that came out very recently that said that they were planning to test in Corsica. And if you know the history of Corsica as well, they were also a little bit less important than the French, but then the movement there was quite strong and opposed it. And kind of, oh yeah, let's do it in Algeria and do it in the Pacific instead, even further away. So it's a really interesting dynamic around it. And also sort of, there's many interesting linkages also in terms of where the uranium mining, of course, comes from and the impact there. I mean, you can look at a lot of these kind of issues, I think, to see the dynamics of who makes the rules and who gets to suffer the impact and the consequences of those.
Thank you. So let's take some questions. And I want to just, before we start, ask, is there any student who'd like to start us off? Any student questions? If not, we will move on to, oh, great, please, if you could just introduce yourself, thanks.
My name is Scott, I'm a first year at Northwestern. My question is, hello, okay. My question is, so you've been talking about the progress you've made on international diplomacy with a lot of countries that are not one of the 9. And my question is, have you seen movement from those 9 states who own nuclear weapons on sort of reducing their stockpiles in the since your work at ICAN began, 2014?
Yeah, so obviously the treaty, we want them to join, right? But it wasn't the main purpose with the treaty to make them join. So they kind of are our target audience, but indirectly through the other governments in a way. So that was part of the strategy. And we will continue to work to get them to join until they join, really. So I always say they haven't joined yet. And so it's work in progress in many of these countries. These 9 countries, to different degrees, all oppose the treaty. Some more than others. Maybe surprisingly, France is the most aggressive country against it. I think it comes from a genuine approach that they do support international law, and they're very, very angry that international law is being used against them. Whereas if countries like Russia, for example, it's a little bit more comfortable being on the outside of these kind of things. The same thing with the United States. It doesn't have such a big identity connected to international law and human rights like France has. So you can see a bit of a difference. You can also see quite an aggressive tone in the UK, where the issue of Scotland, for example, where nuclear weapons are hosted. The Scottish population is very supportive of nuclear disarmament, wants to join the treaty. The Scottish government has said when we become independent, we will join the treaty. And the UK doesn't really have a lot of options on where to place their nuclear weapons if Scotland becomes independent. So you can also sense a bigger concern there, maybe. So from the government side, we haven't seen any progress. I mean, I think we saw more of a softening in the tone when the Biden administration came in. It didn't really change the policy from the Trump administration, but you could see there was more of a constructive tone. But what we have seen is a lot of other types of support, right? Like Chicago, for example, and all these resolutions. And to me, that's, the governments are the last ones that are going to change. So what we're actually seeing is trying to use the treaty to build all this kind of support and to use it in very creative ways to kind of shift the perspective in a country that has nuclear weapons. So getting banks to divest from the production of nuclear weapons, getting universities to not spend their scientists' capacity to building nuclear weapons, but doing better stuff with their knowledge, to kind of build political interest in the issue and build public awareness to pressure politicians. And ideally, that would shift eventually. In terms of the numbers, they have, of course, we had a peak of nuclear weapons around in the 80s, in the mid 80s. I think it was around 70,000 nuclear weapons. We're down to 13,000. And we've seen kind of a, in the 80s, massive drop. And then it's kind of flattened out. And what we're seeing now is that through the New START treaty between the US and Russia, for example, it has been a lot of, been some decommissioning. But of course, it slowed down. And what we're seeing from China and the UK actually has been an increase, and North Korea as well. I mean, these are still very small numbers. The US and Russia still has, I think, 95% of the global nuclear arsenals. So China, sometimes when you read, especially in the American media, you sort of, China's catching up. The US has 6,000, China has, I think, 300 at this moment, 350, I think maybe it is now. So it's still pretty far away from catching up, but it's obviously a worrying trend that they are in. And what we are seeing is huge investments in nuclear weapons, in modernization programs. So that's definitely something we'll be fighting. Please.
Thanks for your presentation. Oh, sorry. Name is Bob. Thank you so much for that presentation. Process question here. One can imagine, say, Xi or Putin or the leadership of those countries in some future scenario agreeing to a treaty such as you have outlined and has been signed by so many other countries. But when it comes to countries like the US, we have a double obstacle. We have to find a president who would enter into the negotiations, and we have a requirement, as I'm sure you know, that no treaty goes into effect in the US without 2/3 of the Senate consenting to it. So we have to imagine the gap between the present political reality of the US and 2/3 of US senators consenting to such a treaty?
Yeah, I mean, the US reluctance to join international law lately is obviously a problem. But I also think that we have to then think creatively, right, around that. How do we move around that? And I think in some places they've started to do these. The US is campaigning a lot in the UN for different non-binding document that doesn't have to have Senate approval to get around it. Or yeah, it's sort of like I think the Paris Agreement, right? That didn't need ratification in the Senate because it's an agreement and not a treaty in the same way. That's of course frustrating for other countries who want a legally binding instrument. So you can also see that, for example, like with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which the US has not ratified for 25 years or something like that since they signed it. The US pretty much acts like it's a state party. And I think that's also one of the ways to let the other countries sign and ratify the treaty. The US could sign it and then act like it is. But before we get to that point, I think there's so much work. And at the end of the day, I look at treaties not as the goal itself. It's the elimination of nuclear weapons. So whether or not they sign the treaty in the end, if they just we're never going to sign this treaty, but we're going to eliminate nuclear weapons, I'll take that. That's good enough for me. So I think that what we need to do is really work on making nuclear weapons not attractive to have, right? Making it problematic and difficult and complicated, and that it's much more in their interest to get rid of it. I genuinely see, sometimes people talk about this kind of magic moment where 9 nuclear armed states sit in a circle and they agree to this document and white doves will fly and peace will prevail. I think it's much more likely that we reduce the value of nuclear weapons so much that they also become irrelevant and thereby decommissioned also from just pragmatic reasons, like, well, why do we have these massive radioactive things that don't do anything and actually we can't use them? And that kind of thinking, right? So that's why I'm so talking about the delegitimization as a strategy, because I think we really have to remove the value of these weapons. As long as we see them as this bargaining chip, this kind of ultimate power symbol, it's going to be very hard to get people to agree to get rid of them. But, and as mentioned in my lecture, biological weapons could easily be in the same deterrent power. You can threaten and say, like, if you attack me, I will unleash a deadly virus on your population. But that's something that terrorists do, right? Not states. That's something that, we see ISIS or Al-Qaeda would have done or something like that. It's very unacceptable behavior, even for states. And I think that that's sort of why. Why do we think that it's more unacceptable to unleash a virus than it is to unleash a radioactive bomb, for example, and poison people that way? So I think it's really about shifting that kind of perspective and making sure that it's from a financial interest, from a reputational interest, from public pressure, from all these kind of things that kind of make it more possible. And actually, when you think about the US history of nuclear disarmament in terms of dismantling nuclear warheads, the biggest progress has been done during Republican presidents. That's when we've seen the biggest drops. Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated massive nuclear disarmament, for example. So it should not be a political sort of fight between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. It should actually be just a pragmatic decision that this is what makes the most sense. Nuclear weapons is a thing from the past. I think it's also quite interesting how we see it as such a prestigeful symbol when it's really 1945 technology. It's really old-fashioned, outdated warfare. Right? It's not something that we do anymore. It's not something that is useful on the battlefield. We've heard certain, the military doesn't speak out very publicly on this, but we heard, for example, from the UK, where there was an attempt during budget negotiations. They were in budget cuts, as always, and tried to put the cost of renewal of nuclear weapons onto the defense budget. And the military freaked out. They're like, absolutely not. It's not our weapon. Like, we need helicopters, pilots, these kind of things. We need, conventional weapons. This is a political thing. It cannot go on the defense budget. So they had to put it in the sort of general state budget because the military didn't really look at it as a military spending. It was just a symbolic, prestige, political kind of symbol. So I think that there's ways to do it without having to have Senate approval. And at the end of the day, I think that's also really much the last step. When we change people's minds, that will be much easier. But we need to change people's minds about these weapons first.
So we have so many really good questions from our virtual participants. First of all, one person asks for practical help from you whenever they hear someone say that the use of the American use of the atomic bomb was justified as having saved lives, despite the fact that there were 140,000 casualties. What is your best argument in response when people say that?
Well, I think, because people often talk about that, Japan would not have surrendered without the nuclear bombs, and then the US would have to have a big land invasion, and there's no real evidence to show that that's how it would have played out. In fact, recent research also show that it's not clear that the nuclear weapons were even the reason that they surrendered. There's been, it was also a way out for the leadership to say to their own population that, well, this new weapon, right? We had to surrender. We didn't want to, but this new weapon, it sort of became a convenient excuse as well for the leaders in Japan. But actually what research has shown is that the decision to bomb Hiroshima did not change their opinion, but what was really defining in the Japanese decision to surrender was the fact that I think on 8th of August, so 6th of August was the Hiroshima bomb, 7th of August they said that we're not surrendering. And on 8th of August, I think Soviet joined the war, declared war. And some say, and again, I don't know, I wasn't there, and I don't think that we really know, but again, also would have been a full-scale land invasion? We don't know, but what we do know is that 140,000 civilians died, and that's a war crime. And I think we also hear very often, as just an extension to that question, is that, well, nuclear weapons have kept the peace since then. First of all, there's been a lot of places in the world where there hasn't been peace. So again, even if you believe in that, you're kind of outsourcing the conflict to proxy war, and other people die. And that's, again, the privilege, racism angle, these kind of things that we can talk about, like who gets to suffer from these things. But again, there's no evidence, absolutely no evidence, that nuclear weapons have prevented a World War III. The absence of something is not good enough as evidence. What you can also say is that since the United Nations was formed, there have been no world wars. But you don't hear people say that. It's exactly the same amount of evidence for both those cases, for example. But one fits the narrative of nuclear weapons and keeping nuclear weapons, and one doesn't really. So I think it's like, who are making these arguments, and what are we getting the arguments for?
Thanks. Let's see, we've got a student here in the back. Go ahead, please, Emma.
Hi there. Thank you so much. My name is Mia. I'm a student. You mentioned a couple of times that nuclear weapon is this really outdated weapon. How does your work with ICAN and your work broader with nuclear disarmament fit into concerns about things such as artificial intelligence, drone strikes, biological warfare that other states are putting a lot of investment and money into?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about now is artificial intelligence weapons, which is really the next thing that we also have to ban, and people are working on that very hard at the moment. And I think that that's, again, being very pragmatic. I think that governments will take these decisions based on what's in their interest at the moment. So it's really up to us to make it in their interest. I see these treaties, and I count sort of the treaties to ban biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, cluster munitions. In a way, it comes from a wish of ending wars, right? But in absence of getting everyone to commit to never having wars or things like that, we're trying to kind of narrow the possibilities for the military to operate and for the kind of civilian impact of war through different instruments and taking it chunk by chunk and trying to say hey, here's a line that we don't cross, here's a line that we don't cross, here's a weapon that causes excessive harm to civilians. So under the rules of international humanitarian law, the rules of war, it should be really banned. We shouldn't use it, shouldn't target civilians. You should, if you commit war crimes, you should be prosecuted in The Hague. So trying to use these tools to kind of guide the world into place. So I think it's really important that we keep aware of these things. And I think now with technology moving so fast, there's just so many ways where we can weaponize different technologies and new developments. And in many ways, I mean, we're talking about a lot about when we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Alfred Nobel invented dynamite, and you can use it for construction and, things that really help people, and you can use it to blow people up. And you can split an atom, and again, ICAN does not take a position on nuclear energy, so we're neutral on it. But I mean, you can use it for energy, and you can use it for weapon. And I think it's the same thing with artificial intelligence, with all these kind of developments. There's a side where it can be used to help people, and it's a side that can be used to weaponize. And I think there's a natural tendency with very powerful actors like governments to always be interested in the weaponized side. And I think it's our job as citizens to constantly no, not that, right? To steer it in a direction of using technology, using innovations in a positive way that helps humanity, not harms humanity. So I think for us, we're very linked to those other campaigns as well, very supportive, and try to use the overlap in certain ways, but also try to not overwhelm people with solving all of humanity's problems simultaneously, because then you can get, it's too much, right? I can't handle. So try to break it down into specific weapon categories and piece by piece, moving towards a place where you're not able to kill a lot of civilians.
So another question from our online community. You may know that Evanston is the world headquarters of Rotary International, which has endorsed the TPNW. And so one of our viewers is asking, what do you see as the importance of international business groups like Rotary in this? And perhaps you could talk about business more generally. Is there a role for business and professional groups?
I think it's absolutely important. And Rotary is a perfect example of that, of a group that comes together and, they have something in common. And then they use that platform, right, to influence and shape the world and guide it in a way. And that's really how we have to work. Nobody can do big, meaningful thing alone, right? And I thought about that when you said, oh, she's probably done more than anyone else. I'm like, no, I really haven't. It's communities, right, that do things, that achieve things, not individuals.
Yeah, but you're the connector. So.
Yeah, but I think it's just really, so I think when looking at businesses, and I think this is something that has changed since 1945, there are companies like Google. I mean, it's more influential than most governments in terms of shaping the world. The OpenAI, for example, is sitting on enormous power, right? It's scary, but it can also be used for good stuff. And to do things, to shape the world, to shape norms and rules of how we govern ourselves. in a positive direction. So I think that, you know, in many ways, business communities have been not involved enough in international law. And I think there's a very strong business case for nuclear disarmament, because a planet that is, you know, devastated from nuclear war is not a great planet for businesses either. But also, you know, in terms of international law in general, like it creates long-term ideas, right, for the world, predictability, transparency on like what is it that we have agreed on, and these are things that help businesses, for example. And then of course different businesses have specific interests. For example, companies that produce artificial intelligence at the moment needs to be involved in making sure that their competitors don't start selling, like making weapons, and they don't, you know, it's an interest from the whole community, like, okay, let's hold these norms, for example. And there's a lot of investors in that, you know, can contribute really well to stigmatize nuclear weapons production, for example, by not lending money, or banks not lending money to companies that are producing these illegal weapons of mass destruction. So you have different communities that have specific angles, but just in general, I think that the business community really has a huge potential to engage in this. And I think, I mean, I would say the same on any group of people. Anyone can like find an angle to why it's relevant for their communities to involve.
Questions over here? Okay. So we'll take one more. Go ahead, please. Last question.
I have a question about is there a difference between your advocacy work when it comes to democratic countries like France and England and the United States versus, you know, some of the despotic countries like North Korea and you know, and China and Russia? And if there is a difference, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, obviously we are not able to work freely in many countries. Our partners and campaigners and activists are being imprisoned, risk for their lives to work on these issues. So while, you know, I'm free to send snarky tweets to my foreign minister in Sweden, a lot of our partners in those countries are just not able to do that. And we have to respect that genuinely and not put people in harm, for example. Many of our colleagues in Russia, for example, have been completely silent since the war has started and do not want to talk. And we have to respect that and not push them and put them in danger in terms of that. But there are other ways to work with them. So for example, one of the things, and I think it's really important to recognize that international law, it's not an issue for just democratic countries. It also has an impact and influence and shapes the behavior of non-democratic states. And it is a very useful tool to use also. They are equally interested in, you know, legitimacy and status and power on the international arena. And actually, like just recently I heard that China has this international legal strategy of educating a lot of international lawyers and making sure that they are sent out and placed in UN institutions to reshape international law into something that is less of the Western-based, human rights-based, democracy-based things, which I think is scary to think about, but also a sign that they understand the power of this, right? That they recognize that they are being influenced and it's complicated for them and they have to fight back and push back on that kind of normative shift. So what we're doing with a lot of those countries is that we are working with, for example, China won't listen to me. Like I can have a meeting with the Chinese ambassador, but it's not really going to make a difference. They will listen to Lula in Brazil, for example. And Brazil is part of the treaty. So we also work through partner countries. Like if they don't listen to us, then we have to be pragmatic about it. It doesn't matter. We don't have to spend time or risk the security of Chinese campaigners. We can also work through other people, or for example, looking at scientists and academics, for example, was during the Cold War in the 80s. It was massively influential exchanges between Soviet and American scientists working together on the nuclear weapons issue, and really shaped a lot of collaboration and opened up a lot of doors that activists couldn't do in the same way. So I think we have to look at it creatively, and we are trying to look at it in that way. Of course, right now, working in Russia is impossible in many ways, People can't travel there. They can't come out. It's very, very complicated. But also, like, for example, the business community could do a lot of work by, working with Chinese businesses, for example, or Chinese universities and these kind of things. So I think we're not only focusing on Western countries, we are working on all countries. It just looks very different, and some of it is not very public because of the risk to people involved in those countries. So sometimes we get criticized, oh, you only nag on the Western countries. I was like, no, we only nag on them on Twitter and the visible part. And sorry that it's such a burden to be a democracy. So it's really, we do try to work, but of course there's certain constraints that we have as civil society.
Well, Beatrice, we have to stop here, but it is truly an honor to have you on our campus today. You've given us so much to think about today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.